Okay, so this is another short explainer to accompany the handout and the work which I posted on. This time it's modern liberalism, and this is where it begins to get interesting in terms of looking at the way in which different tensions, different strands of liberalism are in conflict with each other, are directly contradicting each other. They've been in a conversation with each other. Okay, so what we're going to try and do in this one, we'll try and keep this short because there's quite a lot to talk about in modern liberalism and its four key features. So I'll split these into two, and in this video we'll talk about these two down here, positive liberty and the enabling state, and the way in which those two are connected. So what do we mean by positive liberty? Well, we might start by, I normally use this picture and get people to think about what's going on here. And it looks like it's clearly not a picture that was taken last week. It's a picture that was taken at the end of the 19th century. For most people, it reminds them of Oliver Twist or something similar. It's in a workhouse. It's a bunch of little urchins in London. And in the 19th century, the question we might ask about these people is, am I free? Here are a bunch of people who have observed negative liberty. The state has not interfered with these people. These people are free to do whatever they choose to do as they go through their future lives. But clearly, the poverty that these kids are facing mean that their choices about what they're going to be able to do in their lives are going to be incredibly restricted. And therefore, whilst it's true that the state is not in any sense intervening in their lives, a modern liberal, for example, like William Beveridge, would have said that a starving man is not free. What he would have meant by that is that these kids in this particular picture, for example, don't have the benefit of control over their own lives in order to develop themselves, in order to realize themselves. So this is a problem which modern liberals were dealing with at the end of the 19th century, is that we had this idea of liberalism, and it created this impression that the state should be limited in what it did, and the state should protect people's natural rights, and it should give them a certain element of democracy and so on. But when it came to actually giving or ensuring that each of the citizens could fully develop themselves as people who could become full citizens and develop their full potential, this was a problem because lots of people, poor people in particular, weren't actually free to do so. So what we get in the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, therefore, is this development of an idea of positive liberty, and it's directly in contrast with negative liberty that we saw before. When I say that, actually, one of the things they're doing, these people, and they include people like T.H. Green and Hobhouse and Hobson, is to say, look, take, for example, this harm principle. If the harm principle means that I should be free to do whatever I want so long as I'm not harming other people, well, okay, that might mean that you can say what you want and do all the things that Mill suggested, that you believe the things in religion, for example, that you wanted, and all the things that Mill suggested before. But if your choices that you make as an individual in the economy, for example, end up with you accumulating lots of wealth, but then creating a system which then creates crises, and which then means that other people, like these chaps here in America in the 1920s, 1930s, who have been doing all the right things, have been competing, have been working very hard, but then due to some external forces beyond their control, are thrown out of work. These aren't the kind of idle people or lazy people that Samuel Smiles would have pointed out, or Herbert Spencer would have said, we should just let these people starve in the gutter. These are hardworking people, but they're denied a liberty to develop themselves through no fault of their own. So what we need to do then, modern liberals suggested, was to change our idea of what is necessary to make people free. In order to be fully free, people need to be able to determine themselves. And if external forces like capitalist crises and unemployment are stopping people from doing that, well, then that must mean that it's the job of society and the state to do something about enabling people's self-determination. And we can see later on this comes to liberating people from poor health, because that's something which stops people realizing themselves, and so on. So that idea of positive liberty is in direct contrast with negative liberty, but seeks to try and claim that it's still part of liberalism because it's about maximizing individual liberty. And if you want to think about it really simply, it comes down to this. Negative liberty is about freedom from constraint. Negative liberty says, let me do what I want. Positive liberty says, I'm not able to do what I want. What I need is your help. I need to be helped to. So this contrast between negative liberty on the one hand and positive liberty on the other hand is really important for us because we need to show how they contrast, and it comes down to this. Negative liberty means let me do what I want. I should be free from any kind of constraints from other individuals or from the state. But positive liberty says, help me do what I want. I'm being prevented from being fully able to realize my goals, and I need the help of the state or the rest of society to do so. One, negative liberty is about freedom from any kind of restrictions. Two, positive liberty is about freedom to do things. Freedom from, negative. Freedom to do, positive. Okay. We could have some evaluation here, some AO2 and AO3 stuff, because there are some problems with this. It seems really straightforward, of course, and we've become used to the idea that the state does actually help people to do things like guaranteeing an NHS and so on. We'll come on to that in a moment. But these things are incompatible. Positive liberty, maximizing individual freedom in that way, necessarily involves government action, which involves taking people's taxes, and that's, as far as classical liberals are concerned, an infringement. That's a constraint on people's ability to do things. Or what about education? We think education is so important in maximizing people's liberty that the state forces people to go. It's compulsory. And people, classical liberals, pure classical liberals, would have argued that it's up to parents to decide for how long and to what kind of schools they send their children, and not for the state to mandate them sending them there. So those contradictions mean that classical liberals and modern liberals always disagree about whether negative liberty or positive liberty is the right way of maximizing individual freedom. So that disagreement is nowhere more present than when it comes to what should the state do. We know already, don't we, that classical liberals think that the government is a necessary evil, that Locke says that the only thing that government should do is protect the rights of property. Jefferson, that the government that governs least is the government which governs best. But modern liberals completely disagree, because this question that we've got, should the state look after those who are poor through no fault of their own? We've already seen Herbert Spencer and Samuel Smiles and other people say, no, we shouldn't do that. In this case, modern liberals turn this on its head and say, actually, the state's absolutely the engine that we need to do this. And the reason why they'll do this is because it enables people, because it's a phrase that was used by Lyndon Johnson and then by Bill Clinton. What we need is helping people help themselves. Now, that idea means that it's not like socialism, and modern liberals would make a distinction between them and communism or sharing people's, that using the state to force people to share their wealth or collectivizing things. But it has got some collective solutions to this. So if there are some social and economic problems like capitalism at the end of the 19th century, which produce crises, and society in general has produced those crises, they're not simply one individual who's made those things happen, then it's necessary that government should step in and resolve those crises. And we're going to say a bit more about Rawls later on, who's one of our key thinkers. But for Rawls, this idea of individual liberty means far from having less government intervention. What we need is more government intervention in order to ensure fairness, because one of the problems of allowing society to just run its own course is that it doesn't produce fairness. It produces gross inequality, and that gross inequality in itself reproduces and stops some people being free. Come on to that later on, but let's just have a look at this idea of an enabling state. And we can think about it with these five giants. Very famous cartoon, this, from the middle of the war, middle of the Second World War in 1943. And it was about the publication of the Beveridge Report. There's Beveridge there, who was a liberal lord, a liberal peer. Wasn't a socialist, but he produced lots of the ideas which go into the Labour Manifesto of 1945. So that you could argue the Labour Manifesto is not actually a socialist government in 1945. It's just enacting some modern liberal policies. And the argument was that these people, these things, want, that is to say, poverty, people's inability to get economic security, forcing them to make choices they don't want to do, or limiting their choices, ignorance, their lack of education, their lack of opportunities to develop themselves and then choose careers they might want in the future. Disease, their likelihood of catching illnesses often related to poverty as well, which then prevented them from working and prevented them from earning and prevented them from developing themselves. Squalor and the idea that they didn't have their own space for their family to bring themselves up, but instead were cramped in conditions with several people in the same household, and so on. And then idleness, and he's not lying down because he's lazy, idleness in terms of unemployment. These things, therefore, unemployment preventing people from getting a job, earning their own money, and then being able to develop themselves by buying the things they want or developing their family in the way in which they want. These things were being denied people by external forces which were beyond their control. Therefore, Beveridge argued, right in the middle of the war, when Britain had no money whatsoever and had the hands of fascism round its neck, here is Beveridge arguing that actually what the state needs to do is dig deep into its pockets and use its resources in order to maximise the freedom of people who are less well off by slaying these five giants. So that's where we get the welfare state from. It's where we get the NHS from. And move on to this one. And these programs are adopted in other places and in different ways at the beginning of the 20th century as well. So we get in America in the 1930s a New Deal, and in Britain, even before Beveridge came along, we'd had a kind of a first welfare state of things like national insurance, sick pay for work, and pensions. And you can do a little bit of research about those ones as well. But absolutely key to this enabling state is also its relationship to the economy. And therefore, we're thinking about our four themes here, remember, about human nature and society and the economy and the state. And these two, in modern liberalism, are deeply, deeply entwined. For classical liberalism, the state and the economy should have nothing to do with each other. The economy should just be able to run itself. But modern liberals, and this fella, John Maynard Keynes, is our best example of it, argue that if you just left the economy to run itself, what it's going to do is produce a series of crises. And these crises, based on the idea of overproduction and oversupply, which then mean that there aren't enough people to buy things, and then that means production collapses and so on, happen every 20 or 30 years. And of course, these are the external forces which throw people on the dole and then prevent them from earning an income even if they wanted to. And what Keynes said is that what the state needs to do is to prevent these crises, these kind of huge booms and slumps, and instead it needs to stimulate demand. If the state steps in and guarantees that people have enough money in their pockets by making sure there's a minimum wage, or if necessary, welfare payments, but also if the state creates jobs by paying for bigger public services or having big building projects and so on, then that in itself then creates wages which then go into the rest of the economy and so on. Then stimulating that demand not only means that people who would have been poorer in a laissez-faire economy are now freer because they've got money to spend and because they've actually got work and so on, but it also means that people who run the businesses are better off as well because their businesses won't collapse because there are always people, customers, who have the potential to buy their products. So he argues that rational economic actors would choose this rather than laissez-faire. And therefore they might do so by voting for governments which do so as well, in order to maximize the liberty of everybody and not just people who are wealthy. So for Maynard Keynes, this isn't socialism in a different guise. This is expanding individual freedom, not just of the poor, but collectively of everybody with a collective solution. And what happens later is that John Rawls comes along and gives a theoretical justification, a liberal theoretical justification for why this is still a liberal theory, because it's all about justice. And we might imagine that some people, it's just unfair that they happen to be born as a matter of lottery in some places rather than others, whereas other people are really lucky that they end up being born somewhere. And Rawls argues that, if you didn't know anything about anywhere in the world, but you were going to be dropped randomly somewhere in the world to be born somewhere, what you would want rationally is for everywhere to have a decent standard of living, and for everywhere to have guaranteed a certain amount of equality, so that people could fully develop themselves and maximize themselves. You probably wouldn't want to be born at random in the south side of Chicago. You probably want to be born in a country which could guarantee happiness. And so this question of what a fair society looks like, what a just society looks like, where everybody had a very equal chance of being able to develop themselves, we can answer this question by thinking about, well, which are the countries in which the citizens feel as though they are happier because they are freer to develop themselves in the way in which they want to do, and that's because of the absence of economic insecurity and the absence of external forces which restrict them from doing that. And it shouldn't be any surprise to you, click on the link here later on when you look at this, that it's always a Scandinavian country. And for the last 3 years running, it's been Finland. And if it's not Finland, it's often Norway or Iceland or Denmark. And that's because those countries employ these principles of using the state in order to maximize individual freedom by guaranteeing economic security and softening the way in which capitalism creates external forces which might otherwise limit people's ability to develop themselves. Okay, so those are your first two principles of modern liberalism. And in the next one, in part 2, we'll look at the other things, social liberalism and constitutional reform. As usual, any questions, let me know, and hopefully this will have been some help to complete your handout that we posted earlier this week.